This week, as protests against police brutality have swept Minnesota and the United States, let's talk a bit about a Jewish perspective on protesting and rioting. Now, I'm not a rabbi, but this will be a more personal episode as I share some thoughts that have been rattling around in my head. I only hope that they prove helpful. Let's dive in. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So look, this past week has been overwhelming. On May 25th, George Floyd, an unarmed black man in Minneapolis, died after a white police officer kneeled on Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes, during which Floyd said he couldn't breathe and then became unresponsive. I have no problem calling that murder. That's what that was, and the entire moment was horrifyingly caught on video. And then, people in Minneapolis showed up to protest. Peacefully protest against police brutality. Peacefully protest against the near-constant pattern of unarmed black people being killed by white police officers. Peacefully protest against the lack of accountability for police officers, which, as an example, the now former officer that murdered Floyd had several complaints filed against him going back at least a decade, and he never faced consequences. And alongside those majority peaceful protests, rioting, arson, and looting have also happened. There are reports of both a small group of protesters doing this and masked white men commonly thought to be white supremacists doing so, but let's focus for the moment on the protesters who also rioted, and I will explain why in a moment. But just to state the obvious, the rioting has serious consequences. In Minneapolis, many small businesses, including many minority-owned businesses, already hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, were burned down or seriously damaged or looted. Grocery stores like Target were also vandalized, leaving minority communities without desperately needed access to food and medications. And a building that was supposed to be affordable housing was also burned to the ground. This kind of damage is also happening across the United States as protests have spread. Now, if you want the in-depth coverage on the situation here and the way the community has come together to help those in need, please check out the great local press, the Star Tribune, NPR, KARE 11, the Minnesota Reformer, and others who have been on all aspects of this story from day one. And if you want the Jewish angle, check out TCG Folk, JTA, The Forward, or the other Jewish papers, and particularly read the op-eds by Jews of color, some of which will be in the description for this episode. But I just want to briefly talk about a reaction that I see so many Jews having of, the protests have gotten violent, and that means I can't support the protests anymore, and using that as a way to walk away from the protests and the reasons why the protests are happening. Setting aside for a moment that, the majority of protesters have been peaceful, that it's a little disingenuous to lump everyone together and then dismiss all the protests, and even setting aside that peaceful protests have been met by absurd levels of police violence. This idea that rioting disqualifies protesting is bothering me. Look, I will not mince words on this. I hate the damage that was done to people's businesses, places of work, to the essential grocery stores that people need, particularly during a pandemic that has already killed over 104,000 people in the United States. But I can't dismiss rioting and then dismiss the protesters, because when I look to my own history, it's unavoidable that violence is part of protest. And I think more Jews need to remember that. Not to encourage or advocate for violence, but to understand why it is legitimate expression that we should be taking seriously as such. So let's look at some Jewish stuff. An almost too perfect example. We literally just celebrated a few weeks ago the holiday of Pesach, Passover, in which we remember and tell the story of the slavery that Jews experienced in Egypt and the fight for freedom that brought us out of Egypt. And what was that fight for freedom? God bringing the 10 plagues, everything from destroying crops with swarms of locusts, to turning the number one water source, the Nile River, to blood, to killing every Egyptian firstborn child. These are horrible things done in our story to get Pharaoh to let us go and to grant us freedom. God and Moses functionally burned Egypt down, punishing not just the ruling class that oppressed the Jews, but all Egyptians in these plagues for the just cause of freedom. Now, for those who remember the Passover Seder, we, meaning the Jews of today, don't love the damage that we caused. We explicitly pour wine, a symbol of joy, out of our cup to symbolize that we do not like that these plagues were sent. And yet I have never seen or heard any indication that we might have gained our freedom any other way. The plagues were necessary for freedom. So even as I hate the damage that has been done to parts of Minneapolis by some protesters themselves, I can't turn around and say, you've done this, so your cause isn't just, go home. How many Egyptians might have said the same thing to Moses, and what if he had listened to them? And this is kind of a weird point to be making, I have to admit, because like so many other people, I want to believe in some level of moral absolutism. I want to believe that, burning down small businesses is just wrong and that's it, because, almost automatically, of course that's wrong. It feels weird to have to explain why. But the buck can't stop there. We are talking about protests against oppression and over-policing, deep systemic issues of race in the United States. We're talking about a real struggle in this country for Black people and people of color to have their rights and their freedom. Again, the majority of protests have been peaceful, but protests always come with some violence, and that is not something to be dismissed. Another sort of example that keeps bouncing around in my head: in the 1940s, in British Mandatory Palestine, the Jews that were there were divided on how to get the British to leave so that they could establish a Jewish state. Now, to back up a moment, I am not trying to make a full-blooded, Zionist Black Lives Matter comparison here, but there is a point, so stay with me. In pursuit of a Jewish state, there was a small underground organization called the Irgun, led by future Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, that was functionally a terrorist organization. The Irgun bombed British targets, they harassed and assassinated British soldiers, and when Jews were being whipped as punishment for, whatever crimes by the British, the Irgun captured British soldiers and whipped them in return. The Irgun was a violent resistance group that helped drive the occupying British forces out and make room for Israel, a Jewish state that is now near and dear to many Jews around the world. And in 1946, they blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem that was being used as British headquarters. Now, the intent was to only bomb the British and not to kill any civilians working there, so the Irgun originally made phone calls to the hotel saying, hey, we put a bomb there, you have to evacuate. But through a complex and honestly still disputed series of events, the phone calls were ignored and the bomb went off, killing 91 people and injuring another 49. Of those 91 people killed, just 28 were British citizens and the rest were just people who worked there. Now, I'm talking about this for all the Jews who may love Israel and be in this boat of, the protesters are violent and therefore I can't support the protests. Violence helped get a Jewish state. Violence, like the destruction and death of the King David Hotel, helped drive out the British. It may be terrible, in fact, it was absolutely terrible, but violence is not a completely unforgivable and incompatible part of protesting. We should remember that even if we oppose violence in practice. And really, for me, all of this comes down to a simple idea. I was once at an event for some, Israeli-Palestinian thing and ended up talking with an elderly guy who had been active in the gay rights movement in Minnesota. And somehow the topic came up of the disruptive and violent riots and protesters in the gay rights movement. And I asked, did that help or did that hurt the movement? And what I remember of his answer is that, he said it helped. The riots gave people who were pressuring politicians more leverage to make behind-the-scenes change happen. Basically, this guy said that it took everything, the whole spectrum of protesting, to make change, even as different parts of the spectrum may have disagreed with each other on tactics. But just to hammer in that point one more time, about not dismissing rioting on the part of protesters from a Jewish perspective, here's something that Rabbi Tali Alder, an educator at the Hadar Institute in New York City, wrote on Facebook a few days ago. Quote, "Let's talk for a moment about the parts of our liturgy that embarrass us. You know the ones I mean. The last stanza of Maoz Tzur, a song traditionally sung for Hanukkah, where we essentially call for the downfall of Western civilization. The end of the Passover Seder, where we ask God to pour out his wrath upon the nations that know him not. The end of the paragraph we say before benching or doing the blessing after eating every weekday, imagining unspeakable violence against our captors. We deal with these pieces in different ways, by leaving them out or ignoring them, or in some cases replacing the word wrath with love. And we do that because today, for white Jews living in America, those sentiments feel embarrassing. Are we violent, wrathful people? How can we possibly call for God's violence against the people we live among, the ones who treat us, for the most part, like part of them? But today, I want to suggest we revisit those pieces, because they made it in for a reason. And that reason was that for so long our ancestors lived in such horrifying oppression in places where their lives were cheap, and situations where they knew there were no guarantees that their blood meant any more to their neighbors than that of animals. And so our ancestors cried out for justice, justice that in its purest form would have demanded the images we now abhor. I am not hoping for or advocating, God forbid, violence. I still hope that there can be justice in this country without the unyielding wrath of God. But I am saying, as inheritors of these images, it is our responsibility today to remember, to reread the passages that embarrass us and to try to step past that shame, to know that our ancestors for so long felt holy rage that they encoded in our prayers and most sacred ceremonies, and to remember today that while we might no longer viscerally feel the holy rage of the oppressed, the least our sacred texts demand of us is that we remember it, recognize it, and honor it when we see it. God forgive us if we forget." End quote. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.